started. Thank you guys for joining us today. My name is Maggie Fletcher, and I am one of 3 co-presidents of Wharton Women in Business. And we are so excited to be co-hosting this McNulty program, the Leadership Lecture Series. So for those of you who are new to the series, these conversations feature the world's most influential leaders and policymakers as they share their path to leadership and discuss the various challenges they've faced along the way. Today, I am thrilled to announce our speaker, Beth Comstock, the former Vice Chair and CMO of GE. Over the last 3 decades of her career, Beth grew from storyteller to chief marketing officer and led GE's efforts to accelerate new growth and innovation. Beyond that, she's the director at Nike, a trustee at the National Geographic Society, and the former board president of the Cohort Hewitt Smithsonian National Design Museum. Most importantly, we share an alma mater. Beth graduated from the College of William & Mary.
So we know Maggie's really smart.
And we're extremely fortunate to have this conversation moderated by Laura Zarrow. Laura is the executive director at Wharton People Analytics and the host of Women at Work, the Sirius XM station. Laura has spent her career implementing innovations to advance strategic goals of educational institutions and the needs of diverse learners alike. So with that said, please help me give Laura and Beth a very warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Maggie. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about Beth's story. And as you'll see in the book, which I strongly recommend, she walks us through a journey that's not just how she got from there to here, but in many ways tells us how we can bring some of those lessons into our own lives. And so we're going to have a few questions for you, Beth, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So for many of us, we think of marketing as the voice of an organization, the place that persuades the outside world. But as you articulately explain in the book, and in a way that I think really shaped your work that followed, you saw it differently. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I do think marketing is about that persuasive voice, the story you tell, but I think it's much more. And because marketing hadn't really been defined well at GE for a couple of decades, it was easy opportunity to find a new definition. And for us, it was, hey, marketing's about what you do in the beginning of the business process. It's what happens when you take the title seriously. It's about living in the market. When you live in the market, you see where change is happening. You understand the future a lot better. It's about insights. It's about what do your customers really want for the future? How do you help your customers move? And so we really tried to adapt marketing to be what you do at the beginning. It's, if you think of it, maybe the GPS of the organization, kind of where's the world going and how do we not only keep up, but how do we potentially shape markets and make markets in the future? That was a big departure for a company that largely thought marketing was advertising or trade shows. And especially in enterprise business-to-business marketing, it was there to be defined in many ways. So that's what we did, and it kind of led to market-back innovation and created some tension, which I think is really healthy, where a lot of companies, you're innovating because you have technological, progress, which you need, but it's not always tethered to the market, where the market's going. And so we ended up creating some good tension in the company where we duke it out. And sometimes just because a customer says they want it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And so I really like we almost kind of created both sides of the brain operating in the company, and I thought that was really helpful.
I want to talk about the tension from the other side,
Yeah.
where you started to realize that there were needs in business across the world, in energy, in the delivery of content and entertainment, and all these places that you touched, that GE wasn't really understanding or ready to serve. And so in an organization that was so outstanding at delivering a quality product, there became this gap between what GE was prepared to deliver and what you saw was going to be necessary for GE's future.
Yeah.
How did you start to bridge that gap?
Yeah, well, first we hired a lot of great people who had done that kind of marketing. Many here from Wharton, I want you to know. I did a lot of recruiting personally here. So that was the first thing, just to hire a lot of market-minded people in a company that didn't know what that was. 150 MBAs a year who came with a toolkit to be able to say, actually, let's show you what marketing can do. ask different questions. We needed examples. The first thing we did was we created what we called imagination breakthroughs. It was just a protected class of ideas, a way to show this is how market-backed innovation happens. So you need proof points. People need to see an example. I'll give you 2 examples. One was really simple. It was, we looked at the region of the Middle East in our energy business, and they said, hey, by resegmenting the market, we can create new applications for existing customers and take existing applications and go to new customers. We're just going to resegment the market, and they found $200 million of new revenue opportunity. That got people's attention. It was real money. They could see it. And then there were situations like another one I like is this is a little bit later, but our MRI division, because they were so just pure about the technology, they made the best MRIs on earth. But they missed the fact that people in the world were getting bigger. And they couldn't fit
And
in
not
that
this way, this way.
girth, bigger girth. And they couldn't fit in that donut hole of the MRI. But our competitor Siemens had figured out that the market was going that way and made a bigger girth MRI. And yet the technologists didn't want to degrade the image. And so we missed the market. And again, that was a negative example to say, see, market-backed innovation works because we missed market share. We lost our competitive advantage because we didn't keep pace with the way the market was changing. So we use those kind of examples to the people who knew how to do it, and those examples that showed real revenue or loss of opportunity as a way to show examples.
Now, finding the examples is one part of the challenge.
Yeah.
The way that you communicated the examples,
Yeah.
Would have been very different had not been in marketing.
Yeah.
But it was also an important part of this success. Talk to me about how you started to deploy storytelling.
Yeah, so storytelling was critical. I mean, to me, story is everything. It's the strategy. Your strategy is only as good as your story. Your story is only as good as your strategy. And I'll give you an example. When we went into the clean tech space with what we called Ecomagination, similar to what I was saying to Laura earlier, we did a lot of this market-based discovery. We saw the patterns. Our customers, many of our early adopter customers were saying, help, we need to have better technology that's cleaner. We see regulation, but we can't go broke doing it. Help, GE. We went deep into discovery. We held dreaming sessions with customers that I can come back and talk about. But we needed a way to articulate what we saw. And so we told this vision of this story. I mean, we made it distinctly optimistic. We called it Ecomagination. Basically, this idea of imagination. We said, how are we going to solve a clean tech problem in a world that didn't expect GE would have the solution, let alone industry? You pollute things. How could you possibly be about a green future? We tapped into the optimism. We said, the world's fuel sources are limited, but what's not limited are imagination. Let's apply our imagination to the ecological challenges of the world, and let's do it economically. That's called Ecomagination. We did ads and dancing elephants and all kinds of things, but behind that was some real serious action, and I think that's the other part of story. You set a vision, you've got some people who are with you, our early adopter customers, and then we had to have action. And again, this is where I think sometimes marketing falls off. You have the beautiful vision, you have the story, but maybe you don't have the action. We invested billions in new technology. We created a scorecard. We held ourselves accountable. We're going to reduce these emissions, so we signed up for action. We partnered and brought in some of our biggest critics who had criticized us in the clean tech space. We invited them in to keep us honest. We were honest, maybe that's the wrong phrase, but to make sure they felt we were being honest, to kind of a scorecard that we'd release to the world of our progress. Those are the things you have to do to make the story real. It had to be action, because if not, it would have been greenwashing. It would have been an opportunity that customers are like, you're not serious. This was real investment, real action we could track, and revenue that we could show to the businesses.
This was also part of how you started to take root in the organization as an innovator, of building teams that could start to make change. But this need for storytelling wasn't just at that very high level coming out of marketing. It had to start to happen in meetings with your colleagues, with teams, at retreats. Talk to me about how you taught your community to tell stories.
Yeah, well, I think everyone has storytelling capability. We just doubt it. I think that's why I think everyone's creative. We just doubt ourselves. In some ways, we embrace social media as a way to challenge people. We unleashed we opened up the company. I think just to take a second, if there's something one of the things I'm proud of in my career is that, one, I opened myself up to a lot of new connections, a lot of new discovery. I think I helped open GE up to what's new and next, and I'm very proud of that. If there's anything I could say I've done, it's that. But partly we had to open ourselves up to new ways of telling stories. And so people thought it was frivolous. No one buys from a story. They only want the hard facts. Don't you realize we're B2B? That might work if you're selling toothpaste, but no one cares about a story if you're selling a jet engine. I used to get, no one's going to buy a jet engine from watching an ad on TV. Why are you wasting our money? So that's the backdrop on which we unleashed an army of storytellers. And what we did is we like opened ourselves up. We said, come in and tell stories about this, about what we do, making the invisible visible. People didn't understand what we did. We opened ourselves up to how we manufactured stuff. We had people come in and tell stories. That my favorite one is a filmmaker came in and talked about hydraulic braking, but he used Jell-O, vats of Jell-O, dropped big objects in it to tell how hydraulic braking worked. It told it in a way, a story that was so compelling. Another group of guys did slow motion video about nanoscience, and it made it so compelling. You wanted to be a nanoscientist. So we just opened ourselves up to different storytellers who made that kind of science and the kind of wonkiness accessible. And it, interestingly, attracted customers in new ways. For example, we went after rail enthusiasts. They're called foamers. I don't know anyone here who would identify as a foamer, but that means you foam at the mouth. You love the rail business. And we told a lot of stories about how trains were made, the hydraulic braking of a train, how you get your juice from Florida to Boston because of this crazy way a juice train operates. We were really unleashing stories about trains. Yes, we were hoping that people would buy trains, but we were also trying to influence all the decision makers in the process of how a train, a locomotive gets bought. People who would come to work for GE because they were like, I like trains as a kid and I want to go work, boy or girl. I like those trains. And that's what we were able to unlock, and the stakeholder engagement and the kind of carving a little bit of mind share in everybody's brain before we could guarantee the market share. And that was really our journey.
So another place where that came home to roost in a really powerful way was actually in skills that you taught your own team in order to tell people stories about what they were trying to build. Because one of the challenges with innovating, even up close, not even with your whole marketplace, is how do you take the idea that you have and help the people that you're trying to work with to make it real understand what you're talking about and get excited about it. So talk to me about the press release.
Yeah, so thank you for that prompt. Just taking tools that I had learned as a communicator, that I had learned in marketing. One of my favorite tools is just if you have a business plan as a strategy, write it as a press release. So we'd have to teach people how to write a press release. And they're like, yeah, but I'm not a communicator. Yeah, but you need to know how to communicate it. Why? Because the headline is the summary of your strategy. The quote you put in. And you start to give people a logic to test their strategy. And the point was, if you can't tell your story in a press release, if it's a bunch of gobbledygook, and no one knows why you did this deal, then maybe you don't have a rationale for why you did it. So that was a way to start to, simple things like using social media. We created something called the Tweet Squad, and we'd encourage people to condense their offer and their value proposition into a 140 character tweet. Right? That was a way of training people to tell a story about what they do. In the beginning, be like, but our customers aren't on here. Oh yeah, they are. And all you needed were one or two customers that said, yeah, I'm going to do that. I want to, and so you needed a few early adopters, but you were arming people with those tools and sort of encouraging a feedback loop.
Why wasn't PowerPoint the solution?
PowerPoint's never the solution. You guys teach anti-PowerPoint presentations here. I don't know how many people still use PowerPoint. I still did, but PowerPoint isn't the solution because it doesn't tell you a story, right? It doesn't, and I tried in vain. I never was successful in eradicating PowerPoint. We try to get things into a set of documents you'd read before. You'd have people come in with questions, but people wanted the security blankie of their PowerPoint. Because why? They wanted to already know the answer. They didn't want to be surprised. They wanted somebody to lead them to what it was, not to ask the questions. And I think that's just one of the challenges we have to overcome in companies.
Right, because it's the questions that actually lead to
Exactly.
meaningful change. So I want to switch gears a little bit. One of the things that you did at GE was that you seeded and cultivated a culture change. In many ways, you were identifying and overcoming biases in decision making. You were trying to change entrenched norms, and you were dealing with identity politics, not demographic identity, but kind of work identity, what our roles are, how we define success. And one of the things that was important in changing the OS is we hear all the time, if you want to change an organization's culture, it has to start at the top. How did you work with the top of the organization to change that culture, and what did you learn along the way?
Yeah, I think my big learning is change can't start from the top. Yes, the top has a critical, important role of setting a vision and reinforcing it with accountability and measurement. But if you're not enlisting everybody in the organization as part of that change, you're dead. And in fact, I think some of GE's challenges that you've seen play out in the past 18 months have been some of that tension between the near term and the long term, and the culture shift that needed to happen, the speed with which things were changing and people didn't recognize it. I'm a big believer, I think, and all of you have worked, you're here because you've worked in companies before as well. I wrote this book, and I feel our biggest challenge, and I hope you're studying this in business school, is we don't think enough about the middle of the organization. We don't think enough about the people in the middle of their careers. If change is going to happen, it's the people there. That's where the power is. And too often we just tell them what to do. We don't give them the space to figure out how to do it. And I'm just on a mission to say that's got to change. And that's what I saw. To me, culture change is like the climate. You've got your global climate, and then you have microclimates. And so the best you can do in any team, what can a team do to change the whole culture? What can one CEO do to change the whole culture? Really. The best all of us can do is change ourselves, the way we work, and the people we work with. So you're talking about microclimates. It's a lot of creating feedback loops, giving people permission to kind of test things out, to make mistakes, to have the forgiveness of failure and those kind of issues. You're allowing the people, the room, you're saying, here's a vision, now you figure out how you get it in your particular situation. It's not tops down, it's not a simple framework of this chevron leads to that chevron, and you do that chevron and you're done. Those change management days are over, if they really ever were true.
So one of the places that you turn to learn new ways of doing things was Silicon Valley and startup culture, which obviously was wildly different. But one of your big challenges, and I think one of your many successes, is that you found ways to bring those two cultures together.
Yeah.
What were the first things that you learned about startup culture that GE needed to embrace?
Well, I think the first thing I needed to learn is entrepreneurs are everywhere, and I needed to go to Silicon Valley and hang out with those folks to say entrepreneurism to me is just you see a better way and you take action to make it happen, and there's a boldness and an intensity of problem-solving purpose about it, and that needs to exist everywhere. I think the focus on solving that customer problem was something I know we had lost at GE. I think most companies do. We'd let siloed bureaucracy get in the way, and we lost perspective. I love that Peter Drucker quote. Without a customer, there is no business. Is there ever a truer quote for business than that? And that's what startups do incredibly well by and large, right? They solve a problem in a very focused way, and they know who their customers are, and they go from there.
One of the people that you partnered with as you were building Hulu was Jason Killer.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talked about in the book was, whereas building teams could have taken a lifetime at GE with elaborate search processes, one of the things that Jason, you called it the Ocean's 11 approach, that he tapped into his network and assembled this team of rock stars from all over the globe. As you were describing it, I could see the glossy pictures in the movie version. Talk to me about why that worked, and then I have a question about it because there's something that scares me about it.
Yeah, no, I'm going to go where I think you're going. It worked because it was quick, nimble, and he was able to get people who he trusted immediately and to get action fast. And if you're going to ask, yes, but isn't that the problem with Silicon Valley today? My answer is yes. I don't know, is that what you were going to ask?
Pretty much close to that. Yeah.
What were you going to ask?
Well, because it seems like it perpetuates a kind of bro culture.
It does, and I think that's a big watch out, and I think we're seeing that play out in Silicon Valley. And that would have been the other thing I learned about hanging out in Silicon Valley, that I think big companies do better. But Silicon Valley became so insular that they had all the answers. We've seen that happen in the course of a decade. they in many ways weren't imagining forward unintended consequences of what some of their actions were. They set up a code that said, we're about meritocracy, but only a few people set what the merits are. And then they looked at big companies and said, we're better than you. Yet there was a lot they could learn from big companies that didn't. Culture at Uber. Does anybody want to, you want to compare the culture of a JP Morgan Chase to an Uber? Which would you sign up for right now? Right? I think we, most of us would trust the JP Morgan that might be a little slower, but hey, they know what they're doing. I think some of the consequences we're seeing in Facebook about not having some of the think ahead, scenario planning, strategic thinking that it may be a more established company, getting to scale is really hard. Tesla could be learning a lot right now from how companies, established manufacturing companies, get to scale. Yes, they need to keep that tension of doing it different, better, but that's what I feel Silicon Valley has missed. And because of that, their filter has been insular. They think everybody has to wear a hoodie. Everybody has to largely be the bro culture that created it. And what got them there is not what's going to get them forward. And I think everyone has to wrestle with that.
So you did such a brilliant job of translating Silicon Valley culture into GE, of bringing it in pieces, and it's its own rich story that's in the book. What advice do you have? Because I have a feeling that if we look across this room, we have people who, some may be going into corporate environments. I wouldn't be surprised if more and more of them are winding up in entrepreneurship. How do you start to build out your own startup quickly, with that nimbleness, with that trust, without replicating that insular team?
Yeah, I love that question. I think Wharton's always been such a great entrepreneurial hotbed. One, I think I'd encourage you that there are entrepreneurial roles in big companies, and you're seeing more of those, and I'm encouraged by that. So don't think you can't be an entrepreneur in a big company. You have to choose well, though. Mm-hmm. And so to your question, your question is how do you prevent?
How do you build your own team when you need to move quickly,
Yeah.
when you're putting your own resources on the line, and you want to work with people that you
Yeah.
trust, but at the same time, if you recognize your core team is going to shape the life of that company, you could be working with them for years
Yeah.
to come. How do you move quickly but diversify?
And I think you need to think about stages of development. Again, the people who get you through stage 1 may not be the people to get you to stage 2. You're playing long-term and short-term. One, you're constantly building your pipeline of people who are ready for a job three jobs from now. You may need to take more time in building your pipeline. If your network is only people like you, that might be successful like Jason did in your Ocean's 11 strategy, but 3 years from now, you're not going to be as successful. So take that time to build a diverse pipeline of different thinkers. Do you ask yourself, do you have enough people who are challenging you, who bring a different perspective, who think differently? If everybody looks and talks and thinks like you, and they all went to Wharton, and you're only hiring people from Wharton, we know they're all smart, but is that the smartest thing to do? So is there too much, is it too homogeneous? Are you taking some time to go out and find different thinking? Are you partnering in different ways? I think that's another thing you need to do critically. Find good partners who maybe are scaled in different ways, who can help you do things that you don't need to do yourself. So I think understanding a partnership strategy, and then have an ongoing plan that some people you're going to have to change out. Some people in phase 1 aren't going to make it to phase 2 or phase 3, and they might be your best friends, and and it may be you. You may be the one that, as a founder, can only take it so far, and do you have that kind of knowledge about yourself? The last thing I'd say is, are you setting up the right feedback loops? Do you have feedback loops from your team, from your customers, from other people, stakeholders, that you're constantly vetting? We think this works, but do they? Mm-hmm. How do I know? How do I know when to listen to and not? And if you don't have those feedback loops, you're going to be surprised, because you're going to think you're doing it so well and you haven't listened to people who are telling you differently.
So I want to bounce back to the other side of the equation, particularly in the big organization, although this could happen in an entrepreneurial setting as well. Talk to us about success theater.
Yeah, so success theater, I think it happens everywhere, but it does happen a lot in big businesses where you just want to show everybody, you're putting on a show. It's theater. Everything's great. Okay, I'm sure they don't teach you this at Wharton, but I saw a ton of business plans that look like this. Steady, no growth, no growth, no growth. Year 3 or 5, phew, hockey stick. And no one challenges the plan. Oh, sure. Year 3 to 5, of course, it's not that good. No one's willing to say that's absurd. That's never going to happen that way. No one's willing to say that idea is bad. The customers actually don't like it. Actually, our competitors have already done that. Actually, you're spending too much money at this phase, so they're not willing to call out that the baby's ugly, the idea stinks, the customer's not going to be there, and they just pretend, usually because of a hierarchical situation or office politics, they just pretend, bravo, bravo, and often they leave the room and they go, that idea stinks. But they're not willing to be transparent and open about it, and it leads to really bad behavior when people greenlight things that they know aren't going to happen. They reinforce behavior that they know is not helpful, and that becomes kind of really caustic to your culture. So what we tried to do a lot, especially the end of my time at GE, was really the kind of agitated inquiry, beating up, asking different questions. What's your hypothesis? What problem are you trying to solve? Really interrogating the ideas and not, creating the transparency, other feedback loops so that you could challenge your teams. Intentionally seating people who were there to disrupt what was working well. Red team, blue team exercises, which I'm sure you do. We incorporated that into the way we work.
How did you create the psychological safety that was necessary for people to do that wholeheartedly and effectively?
And I'm not sure we did as much as we should have, if I'm really honest. I think that's one of the hardest things, back to that success theater. If everybody's pretending like everybody's great, and you don't say something, then no one feels safe saying that it's not great. And so again, back to those microclimates, how do you change it? You set up a system in your small team where you kind of have an agreement. We're going to tell each other what we don't want to hear. We're going to deal with the conflict. It's going to be okay, but a decision's going to be made. That's a key thing. We're going to debate, but the decision's made, and when we leave here, we're all going to go right. You're not going to leave here and say, I'm not going to support that. You're all going to go right until we find new evidence that says we're going to go a different way. So I think that kind of giving people permission, getting people aligned around that kind of sort of trust that really they see the action happening. I think that's what has to happen, and you can't do that except individual teams agreeing and changing the way they behave.
And this very definitely is part of a microclimate.
Yeah.
One of the things you talked about was that GE's reputation, that core part of its culture that was about excellent execution, made this kind of thing anathema.
It did.
People were really frightened.
They were afraid because a couple of things. Again, this is part of the short-term challenge we all have in business right now. Always make your commitments. Always make your commitments. In GE, what started as always make your commitments to your customer became what always make your commitment to your investor. Always make your commitment you cannot miss. You cannot miss a quarter. You cannot miss a shipment. You cannot miss. But we know that's not realistic. You must miss. And so that breeds success theater, because we're not going to miss. We're not going to miss until we miss. And then it's a huge, colossal failure, and everybody's running around, how did that go wrong? So I do think that is part of that sort of checklist, quarter after quarter, promise. It's not sustainable.
And we just project manage with a lot of PowerPoint to get it to the point where we've convinced ourselves
that it's exactly, you hit it, Laura, it's exactly what it is. It's success theater, very large, and then what happens, and you're writing off some really big mistakes that way, because no one had we didn't have the mechanism often set up. I'll give you a good example. We, in embracing entrepreneurs, and we were trying to seed energy storage. We called it Durathon. It was basically battery technology, and it's still the future. We just didn't get there. But we hired a great internal entrepreneur. What we did wrong is we threw all the money at it early, and we built this really big factory. And no one was willing to say that's the wrong way to do it. That might have worked when we had plastics back in 1999, but that's not the way it's going to work today in 2007 or whatever it was. But people were afraid to say that. We poured money into it. We didn't validate the customer. And we had to write the whole business off to the tune of $250 million. Meanwhile, all along, people in the team knew they couldn't do this. They kept getting new targets because they were put in a kind of profit model where they didn't even have a customer validated. They kept signing up for more targets, and eventually they failed. We had to write the whole business off. We ended up using it as an instructive case study that said what we should have done was this transparency, the truth-telling. you would have first said, let's validate our hypothesis. Let's get one customer and validate it. Let's build a small factory. Let's spend $20 million. And when we can show we can get from one set of customers to two, we'll spend more money. And we'll go in a very transparent, truthful way. We'll say what isn't working. But what happens is companies convinced we can do this.
And also because it was part of GE culture that you could think at that scale about
Exactly.
other things. But
Exactly. It couldn't apply. And so no one's willing to say that isn't going to work. Or people didn't listen. That's the other thing. They didn't listen to the people who said that's not going to work. They got drowned out by, you can't say that here. We don't talk that way here.
So part of what you had to do was introduce the notion that failing was actually necessary to not fail. Tell us about how you set up VentureWorks and
Yeah.
how it was different within GE.
Yeah, so the first thing we did is hanging out in Silicon Valley, we really grabbed Total Lean Startup, which was a great tool for us. Eric Ries, I'm sure he's been here to talk, but it's kind of he was Steve Blank out of Stanford, the father of Lean Startup. But this idea of a minimally viable product proved to be incredibly valuable to us, of a prototype. Let's just test it. I document in the book this case study, which you can read, but basically we pulled in a really tough hardware problem that had been this vexing problem where we were behind, and the team was convinced that it was technical challenges. It ended up being bureaucratic challenges. And really the challenge was, hey, can you just prototype it? Can you just get one example out into the market? What you're doing now is over-engineering the product. It's going to take you 5 years. You're going to be over budget. Can we just get one example into the market? Can you just do that? The team agreed they could. It worked. And people started to see, we took some of our toughest projects and kind of did this test and learn with customers. And people saw, hey, we could test this. We could test on a small scale. We could fail with a small customer before we had to take it to our mega customer. And people started to be convinced that was a much smarter way to work.
Okay, I have my last question for you before we open up the floor to questions for everybody else. You got to know GE like very few people do. You were there for over 25 years. And we got to talk earlier about how you also, were connected to the company. You admired it, you understood it, you respected it, you were proud to be part of it.
I was in my blood.
Okay, so if, today you were appointed CEO of GE, what would you do?
Yeah, I almost got a GE tattoo once. That would have been really bad. It turned out a bad mistake, right? It was a challenge I was trying to give the team, and then I realized it wasn't a hard challenge, so I didn't do it. But yeah, well, they just announced a new CEO, the third in the past 18 months, and the fact that Larry Culp's coming from Danaher, I think, is a good sign. I think to bring in an outside perspective to solve some problems in a new way, I'm encouraged by that. So that's one of the things I would. If I had done that job, I would have said, let's bring in some more outside perspectives. We were trying to do that with digital, but I would have brought in much more. I would say, let's continue the path to simplify. The conglomerate model no longer really works. There's a lot of basis strength here. Let's not forget that there's a lot of good things, the future of manufacturing, 3D printing in metal, the digitization of industry, the clean tech future. These are still part of the future. We got to figure out a way to make those work. And continue to refine that performance, the balance sheet, and some of the things that continue to need cleanup. You don't have an option to do one or the other. You have to do both. So that's what I would have done, and hopefully that's what the new guy will do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, folks, who's got a question?
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about GE as a company, just building on that last question. So like you said, part of the GE story historically has been cross-company innovation and centralizing the GE story and the culture of innovation.
Yeah.
Oh. But like you said,
You can sing a song if you'd like to too, now.
but over the past year, kind of the investors have forced GE to go down the path of separation, already announcing plans to separate healthcare, oil and gas, lighting, and transportation. So my question is, do you think going down this new path, GE risks kind of losing the ability to do the sorts of things that you were responsible for when you were there as effectively?
I do. I don't think all centralization is good. I think centralization as a way to seed capabilities and then empower the business units to adapt to what they need in their markets is a really good model. But you do have to seed certain things with a certain set of capabilities and then be able to spread it quickly. If that works, then bravo. I personally, if I were running the company, I would really hang on to some piece of healthcare. That is, there's a lot of benefit there. There's a lot of synergies that may not be obvious. You didn't need all those pieces together, and I think you saw there was a lot of simplification. But what is a company if what's left? I don't know. What's left? There has to be a core thesis of a company. There has to be something that you're investing in, a future you're building. And think about a company like GE. The core thesis is we're sort of this infrastructure builder. We make the world go round. We can come into a country and we can provide you with energy, healthcare, transportation. That's a pretty good value proposition still in the world. I don't know if that's the one they're gonna go with, but it's not like it's faulty. But it requires different kind of capabilities. What is that core thesis? I think that's what you'd be, if you were an investor, you'd be holding the new leadership team to. What is that core thesis that makes something hang together?
Anybody else?
I love what you were talking about with the success theater and the importance of feeding up ideas a little bit more before you actually bring them to market. But one thing that I thought of as you were saying those things is that a lot of times in big corporations, businesses are so focused on making sure they have metrics that they can hit before they launch that they never get off the ground. So how do you find the right balance between authentic innovation and then making sure that you're not, shooting yourself in the foot before you start?
Yeah, and that's to Laura's question I didn't fully answer. I think I'm really an advocate for business having kind of two tracks, two speeds, if you will, and we used our venture team to do that quite effectively. Partly was hiring really good venture capitalists who were very disciplined about seeding innovation in a disciplined way, allocating the right amount of capital at the right stage to the right people with the right metrics. That's what you need in an innovation path, and it's very different from core operations. So what I said earlier, asking different questions. There's different models. In some ways you're seeding business with partners. Some you're bringing in entrepreneurs. Some you're investing in companies outside the mothership. So all that has to be part of that kind of fast track for the future, I think, or maybe it's a slow track for the future, really, because it takes time, as opposed to that kind of core, repeatable, nothing's predictable, but a bit more predictable, and that's where I think we get it wrong. I'm really fighting for that and making room for that in companies, and it takes a bold leader that says to investors, no, I'm allocating my capital differently. I want to be held accountable for optimizing today and building tomorrow, and they require different sets of people and capabilities, and you hold me accountable for different returns on both. For example, in my slow fast track to the future, I want you to hold me accountable for how many ideas I'm testing for how little amount of money. So what's my throughput of ideas? How efficiently am I allocating capital? How am I building confidence in what I invest in? How can I give you a degree of confidence so that when I'm moving it from that kind of incubation over to scale, you feel a degree of confidence that tells you I'm going to make this work? Those are some of the things that I think have to happen in business, and honestly, I don't see enough of that because I never once had an investor ask me about this, never once. When we were seeding Ecomagination, it was always, it's too small, it's dabbling, this doesn't matter. And then 15 years later, the investors show up and they go, why aren't you bigger in solar? What's wrong with you? If they were with us on that journey, if they were asking those questions, I think it would have been a much different kind of dialogue. Again, I'm biased. It's confidence, it's boldness, and leaders have to be able to fight for both of those. So as you're building your leadership career, it's a bold leader that can say to people, whether you're an investor in a startup or investor in a public company, you have to be able to say, I run this company, you don't. I make the decisions. I appreciate your money, but you're investing in my vision for the future. Yes, I'm accountable to you, but I run the company, you don't. And I think sometimes we get confused about that. I worked with a startup that went bankrupt, that we had invested in, we were partnering with, and the reason it went bankrupt is because it had too much funding, because it was too distracted. It had too many things it was doing. It had too many investors telling it should be doing these other things, and needed to be, here's my track here, and here's my track here, and I run this company. And so I can also tell you that works in a startup too.
It sounds like in both of those cases, part of what was going on was that they were measuring this new innovative working against the older things that were
Exactly.
familiar to them. And so it's
Exactly.
like they were speaking a different language.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And you need two different languages and two different measurement systems. And yes, I like this idea of a test team, scale team in most companies. It's that two-track. The test team, that was what our venture group was, constantly seeding and testing and getting confidence into a level of launch and growth. But then you gave it over to the core operators who knew how to get it to scale. Perhaps Elon Musk could use that model, right? Where he needs those kind of more scaled operators, and he stays over there and that kind of seed the new and make that happen and get other people who are good at that other stuff.
Right, because you don't need to be outstanding at both. You need,
Exactly.
This is when you need to recognize you need additional.
Exactly.
There was a question over here.
Thank you. So my question was about, a lot of what you're talking about involves a lot of risk-taking and potential for failure, and I know that there's been some research coming out that women at the very tops of their professions, there's a lot less margin for error than there is for men failing in those positions, and I was wondering if either you have any personal experience in that, or what advice you have for women, maybe not where we are, but one day where you are kind of walking that tightrope.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and maybe a question to challenge you for asking it, and everyone in the room. Why do men get all the confidence? Why do men get to define what failure is? And why do we as women let that happen? That's a question I ask now at the end of my career. I'm not tethered to a company, so I can say that, but I did struggle with that a lot. And in some ways, I was able to be more creative, more risk-taking, because people expected less of me in some ways, to be honest. And also because I came in more of a marketing, I was in this area that people didn't really think, whatever, go do. So in some ways, it gave me a confidence boost because I didn't have a lot of the scrutiny that I might have had if I was running a $10 billion business. I wouldn't have been good at running a $10 billion business. I knew that about myself. I had to sign up for those kind of roles as well. So I think in there is also a message of, know what you're good at and look for that kind of capability and kind of declare it. But risk-taking is a part of business, and I think perhaps as women, maybe we think we need to partner more. We're good at partnering. I'm stereotyping tremendously here. But risk and reward, maybe that's a way to think about failing in a new context, that you're able to bring in more partnerships, create the risk-reward mechanism so that that's maybe a new path you're able to create in your organization and create a new light on how to succeed. So I'd maybe approach it in a different way as you're building your leadership career.
We have one more question over here, and we're going to start wrapping it up.
Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for the talk. I actually was a former GE employee for 6 years, so thank you for coming.
Great. Where were you?
I actually was in renewable energy last, so we sat in the same building. I was on top of you. But I'd done a lot of programs like CAST and everything, so thank you so much. My question actually has to do with something you brought up, which is kind of your role at GE, I thought, really did open us up in terms of marketing and just expanding in that area. And now that the company's kind of going through a difficult time, do you think we'll kind of regress in terms of the strides that we had in terms of like marketing and innovation and getting our name and our face out there? Now that we're trying to deal with bigger issues that are around the organizational structure, do you think there's maybe a risk there? Or what kind of succession plans have you put in place to make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, well, I was encouraged as I was leaving Sue Siegel, who was our innovation, who I had helped seed the innovation under her and ventures. She took over as Chief Innovation Officer. But I don't know. I am worried about that. Again, I think in that short-term, long-term, these things often seem as luxury, as something that is a nice to do, and I think it's essential. So that would be a scorecard I would be holding to the new CEO. I'm on the board of Nike. That's a scorecard I hold as a board member to Mark Parker, who's the CEO of Nike. Is he seeding enough new innovation? Is he prioritizing? Is he really? Is he really putting money and the right people toward it? Is he really asking those market-backed questions? So I think all of us as investors need to be asking that question. But I am worried about that for GE's sake, and it causes me a lot of sadness in some respect because a lot of hard work went into that. But at the same time, change has to happen. And I think all of you, as you build your career, there's only so much you can do, only so much you can seed. You hope that some impact has happened. You've left some kind of small imprint, but that the next group has to come and make it work in their way and do it in the way that makes sense for them. And you have to give up that control. You have to, like, I did the best I can. I'm going to step back. It's now somebody else's turn, and I got to go off and try to make that happen somewhere else. So I think you have to also realize there's only so much you can do.
Beth, I can't
Laura,
thank you
thank
enough
you.
for all of
Thanks
this.
a lot.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all very much. One thought, if you have a chance to read the book, thank you. But really, I'm trying to say for all of you, just, change starts with you. And the companies, whether it's a startup or a big company, like, we need more people fighting for the future. We need more people who are doing this and making the kind of future happen. It starts with you, and your organizations need you. So whatever you go out and do, I hope you take that to heart. And it's about doing what you need to do today, but you have to build tomorrow. And I'm sure you're learning that here at Wharton.
Great. Beth, Laura, thank you so much. If we could give them one more round of applause.